Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to speak here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot about Shimer through various people who I know in the audience. Thank you for coming. And I know about Anne's course, which is what inspired me to pick this particular topic today. I've been eager to investigate the Grimke sisters in the feminist tradition. In fact, I've been chomping at the bit. And so I was really excited to have an excuse, which is this talk. I've been mostly working on their lives and figuring out where they were when and who they knew how. But my underlying fascination is with their ideas. And obviously their ideas about ending slavery and ending color prejudice were very important ideas, but the other ideas that I'm interested in are these. As you can see, I gave the title to Anne in January, a fairly broad title, but I've sort of narrowed it down a little bit. So now the actual title is Sarah Grimke and the Feminist Tradition, Sarah being one of the two sisters. That's because I wanted to focus on something focused, Sarah's book, which is called Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Woman. I should add that both sisters wrote a good deal about the subject of women's rights. Angelina's speeches and her letters to abolitionist Theodore Weld contain some brilliant analysis, as do some of her published letters to educator Catherine Beecher. I've got a lot of material here to analyze. So while I focus on Sarah's book here, there is much more to study for the dual biography, and I hope for other, essays as well, because I'm never going to fit all of what I want to study into the biography. I know that already. I should add that I believe Sarah and Angelina's ideas about feminism were mostly the same, so far at least as I can see. I don't see any daylight between them, but it is an important question that I will explore in the book, which is another way of saying I really don't know yet if there were any differences. I haven't noticed any. So who were the Grimkes? I should tell you a little bit about that first. Sarah and Angelina were born to an aristocratic slaveholding family in Charleston, South Carolina. Sarah was born in 1792, Angelina in 1805. So as you can see, there's a 12-year difference between them in age, which was obviously very important when they were young. They moved north separately, not at the same time, to Philadelphia first, in the 1820s, and by 1836 had become advocates for the abolition of slavery, the end of color prejudice, which is their term, and by early 1837, women's rights. And they not only endorsed these ideas, they lived them. They pressured their family to free their slaves unsuccessfully. They sat on the segregated bench in their Quaker meeting with black Quakers. They insisted that all white female anti-slavery societies needed to be racially integrated, and they maintained friendships across the color line. And by 1837, the two sisters were center stage on the nation's fierce debate over abolitionism and women's rights. They were the first women lecturers to campaign to end slavery, and also to campaign to end racial discrimination, the first women to do that. Sarah, in writing her book on the equality of the sexes, was the first American woman to make a sustained argument for women's equal rights. Angelina, in testifying about slavery before a committee of the Massachusetts state legislature, became the first American woman to address a legislative body. And they were two of the main organizers of the first National Convention of American Women, which passed resolutions not only about ending slavery and color prejudice, but also about women's rights. The biography I'm writing will tell this story, and woven throughout will be the story of how their ideas changed. Of course, to know that, you need a clear map of what their ideas were at different points in time. And I have to say as an aside that you would think that would be an obvious assignment of any biographer working with people who had a lot of ideas. But remarkably enough, it does not happen very often that biographers of intellectuals attend to that question, which I think is amazing. So, but I find it fascinating. Anyway, sorting out Sarah's feminism as of the summer of 1837, when she wrote the letters, is obviously an essential task for me. So that's what I get to do here today. Many scholars have noted that her book was a groundbreaking effort. Josephine Donovan, author of the important text Feminist Theory, describes it as presenting the most cogent and elegant arguments against women's subordination developed in the liberal tradition. Gerda Lerner, the Grimke sisters' first scholarly biographer, the editor of a little book called The Feminist Thought of Sarah Grimke, and a groundbreaking historian in the field of women's history, she writes that Letters was the first book written by an American presenting a fully developed women's rights argument 10 years before the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. She calls Sarah a major feminist thinker. Naturally, in reading the book, one wonders, what is new and which of her ideas were already in circulation? Today, we'll explore that subject by comparing Sarah's ideas and the ideas of several contemporaries against the definition of feminism that I also humbly will propose. But first, I must take up the question of using the word feminism to describe ideas expressed before 1900, which is a especially hot topic in the field of history, at least. Some historians have proposed we cannot apply the word to ideas articulated before the first decade of the 20th century. And that's when the French word feminism arrived in this country. But I agree with Miriam Schneer, the editor of the text used in your Western political tradition course. She titled her book, and it came out originally in 1972, sorry. I do that all the time. It came out a long time ago. She titled her book, Feminism, the Essential Historical Writings, and included documents from the 18th and 19th centuries. To take the most obvious aspect of feminism, ideas about women's equality existed before the word feminism was invented, right? So if we are interested in intellectual history, then the term is useful, essential, I would say, to track the presence of certain ideas across time. Those ideas were there, whatever the people of the day called them. What then are the ideas that define feminism? I obviously need a definition if I'm going to discuss Sarah's feminism and that of others. So as the philosophers say, I will posit one. And during the discussion, we can debate the question. So I would say, first of all, it's a call for equality, a rejection of women's status as inferior. Feminism is defined in the dictionary as a belief in the social, economic, and political equality of women with men. But it is more than that. Feminist historians, political scientists, and philosophers generally agree that it also means recognition of the existence of and opposition to the gender hierarchy. That is to say, opposition to the widespread belief system which places the male gender over the female gender in power, respect, and capacity, and a recognition that such a belief system is socially constructed, not predestined by God or nature. Finally, feminism means, or not finally, thirdly, feminism means recognition of what today we call intersectionality, a new term to invent a very old reality, that today and for thousands of years and to varying degrees around the world, a woman's race, class, and sexuality have been and are as central to the nature and degree of her oppression as her gender. And finally, feminism means a political stance arguing for collective political consciousness or action. I obviously don't have time today to analyze Sarah's letters in all four of these dimensions, though I want to. Someday I will. So today I'm going to focus on the first two, which are also the two that are the most fully developed in the letters. But we can explore a little bit the second two in the discussion. I see in letters traces of both an intersectional analysis and a call for political action as well. In presenting her ideas in the book, Sarah believes she was doing something new, mostly new. In the first paragraph of the first letter, she writes, "I fear I am venturing on nearly untrodden ground." For us now, it is hard to imagine just how untrodden that ground was. Nearly all the feminist thinkers we know of had yet to lecture or publish a single thought in 1837. Polish immigrant Ernestine Rose took up the subject of married women's property rights in 1836, almost as soon as she arrived in the United States, but she did not speak on other women's issues until the fall of 1837. Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave her first speech in which she did mention women's rights that same year. Frederick Douglass, who attended, I'm sorry, that was 1840. Frederick Douglass, no, that's 1841. That got screwed up. I changed the Rose date and didn't change the Stanton sentence. So Stanton gave her first speech in 1841, and it included mention of women's rights. Frederick Douglass, who attended the Seneca Falls Convention and was a strong feminist, gave his first lecture on any subject in 1841. Margaret Fuller wrote Woman in the 19th Century in 1845. Lucretia Mott gave her first feminist speeches of record in the 1840s. Sojourner Truth and Lucy Stone made their famous feminist speeches in the 1850s. John Stuart Mill published his hugely influential The Subjection of Women in 1869. But, as Sarah said, the ground was not completely untrodden. Two of the leading candidates for people who were already taking stands like hers are Mary Wollstonecraft, the radical British author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792, and Frances Wright, the radical British lecturer whose speeches in the United States urging equal education for all, including women, which was her particular passion, attracted much public attention and, as you know, controversy in the 1820s and 1830s. To this list, I would add a less obvious person, a person whose feminist writing Miriam Schneer brilliantly includes in her feminist collection, abolitionist editor William Lloyd Garrison. I should add that while Wollstonecraft and Wright are the two most famous proponents of, quote, women's rights before 1837, there were many more women in Great Britain, France, and the United States writing about those rights. In other words, they used the term women's rights, but they meant different things by that than we do today, which is kind of interesting to me because a lot of times people sort of take the term as, oh, well, they were talking about women's rights, but you have to look at what they meant. These writings appeared as early as the late 17th century and especially in the 1790s in the wake of the American and French revolutions. Some wrote brief books, others ventured these daring ideas in magazine articles. Notably for Americans was Judith Sargent Murray's essay published in 1790, and it was titled On the Equality of the Sexes. Now, what she actually had in mind was equality of intellect. And there was Hannah Mather Crocker's book, which has got a great title, Observations on the Real Rights of Women with Their Appropriate Duties Agreeable to Scripture, Reason, and Common Sense. And that was published in 1818. One scholar called it the, quote, first book-length philosophical treatise on women's rights in the American tradition. And there she's saying, well, she's talking about women's rights, and now I'm going to talk about women's rights, differently, but same word. Someday, perhaps, I will be able to consider Sarah's contribution to this wider discussion. For now, I will simply say that neither of these women's writings, meaning Murray or Crocker, came as close to fully discussing women's rights as Sarah did. In any case, today I propose to compare some of Sarah's feminist ideas to what Wollstonecraft, Wright, and Garrison had to say on those subjects. And as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on the two first pieces of my definition of feminism, which is the argument for women's equality and the argument for the existence of a gender hierarchy that was ancient, pervasive, and systematic. So Sarah's commitment to establishing women's equality was captured in her book title, but she knew her readers, male and female, were skeptical, and that to persuade them, she would need to rebut their belief that women were inferior. And more than ever before, this becomes hard to understand. I know for the people who are younger than me, it's hard to imagine. Those my age and older say, oh yeah, I remember. This meant that she had to tackle the two ideologies dominant in the 1830s that justified women's inferiority. In those years, Christianity and the theory of natural rights ruled the culture. They were the basis of most claims for what was true, including claims of women's inferiority. So the biblical argument went that Eve introduced sin into the world when she succumbed to the devil's temptation and ate from the tree of knowledge. Eve was judged weak and inferior for having done this. The natural rights argument, or at least the version that supported women's inferiority, was that only property-owning men possessed natural rights because only they possessed the attribute reason that gave them self-control. Women, ruled by desire and passion, see Eve, inherently lacked natural reason. Therefore, they could not own property, at least when married, i.e. when there was a man to own it, and therefore they were not full citizens. John Locke lays out these arguments in his hugely influential Second Treatise of Government, about which I know very little, so if you want to rebut me on that, I look forward to it. For centuries, aside from a few Latin and Greek reading nuns and brilliant daughters of aristocrats and kings, women had no chance to challenge the dominant interpretations of the Bible, of the story of Eve, or any other parts of the Bible, because they could not read it. The Protestant Reformation in the 15th and 16th centuries, triggered in part by the translation of the Latin and Greek Bibles into common languages, and in part by the invention of the printing press, slowly transformed the situation. In the English-speaking world, literacy and English Bibles spread. By the 1830s, in the highly Protestant, Bible-loving United States, and in the wake of the first and second waves of Christian conversion, called Great Awakenings, the largest percentage of men and women in history in a nation could read and were reading the Bible for themselves, which is a revolution I don't think we can begin to grasp. In addition, there were all these other books people were writing and reading that were about how to interpret the Bible, now that it was a matter of public debate. Churches split continually over doctrinal issues with greater frequency than ever, and the ministers continued to try to assert their various interpretations, and in fact became more and more rigid about denominational definitions because these elements were being so debated. So this was when you knew that the Bible was central to the culture and the Bible had to be interpreted and was a controversial issue. By 1837, Sarah, a devout Christian, was also a self-taught biblical scholar. Not only did she know thoroughly the most popular English Bible, the King James Version, she had learned Latin and Greek. And this is a mystery for me because she clearly makes it clear in letters that she's translating from original languages, but where's the evidence? Where's the letter that says I did well in my Greek lessons today? There's no letter. So what we do know is that her family, her brothers, were all taught Latin and Greek because, of course, they were going to college and they were tutored. And apparently they taught her Latin and Greek. And we know that one brother in particular was very respectful of her brilliance and was very close to her and was probably the one who taught her Latin and Greek. And he was very skilled at it. So in the second paragraph, here's the evidence that she says in letters that almost all the Bible quotations that are used to restrict women are based on false translations, she says, of the Bible. So she declares that she will rely on her own translations. This allows her to interpret it for herself rather than, as she puts it, rely on the views of any man or any set of men. Sarah's first feminist act was to equip herself with the same interpretive skills male ministers gained by earning seminary degrees. The ideas relating to natural rights came to dominate the United States' cultural values partly by a different process. A few Enlightenment philosophers, most notably John Locke, wrote influential books that wealthy men of intellect read. In the United States, some of those men were leaders of the Revolution. As we know, they infused the ideas of natural rights into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I don't need to quote those phrases to you all. But before any of those documents were written, everyday Americans, a high percentage of whom were literate, learned about the ideas of equality and rights in sort of a vague way by reading Thomas Paine's brilliant and brilliantly readable pamphlet, Common Sense. Paine, too, helped infuse the ideas into the culture. I've yet to do the research to pull together what Sarah read that fed her thinking about natural rights, but such ideas were everywhere, so that tracing a specific source is probably not essential. One thing I already know, her brother Frederick, this is a different brother, the brother who she was also very close to, grew up, when she was growing up, Frederick knew Locke's ideas thoroughly, as any young intellectual would have, and indeed they permeate his 1848 book, The Nature and Tendency of Free Institutions. Finally, it would be a mistake to credit natural rights theorists with a monopoly on the idea that every human being is a free, autonomous person. This belief was part of the Quaker faith that Sarah converted to in 1820. She was raised Episcopalian, became evangelical Christian, and then Quaker. A Quaker for 16 years, she absorbed this idea of the equality of all human beings into her bones. The Quakers also endorsed women as ministers, although the reality was often less enlightened than the theory, as Sarah painfully discovered, because she tried to be a minister, but she got pushed down a lot. In her letters on equality of the sexes, Sarah quoted the Bible often to make her case that women were equal and not inferior. This leaves one with the impression that the grounds for her central philosophical argument were mainly religious. But if we look further, we see that throughout the book, natural rights beliefs are taken as a given and are being applied to women. She did not choose to rebut natural rights theory of women's inferiority directly, probably because that was impossible. Locke is much more explicit than the Bible in asserting women's inferiority. Instead, Sarah simply claimed that women had all the qualities associated with possessing natural rights, and sometimes she used the Bible to prove it. The book of Genesis, of course, was the text in the Christian world for proving women's inferiority. Even John Locke cites it as further support for his position on women. Sarah, therefore, starts with the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Why did God create woman? Her answer immediately moves from the framework of sin and weakness to that of natural rights. The Bible says that God created a, quote, help me. That's the key word she's going to translate. The word, she says, properly translated means a companion, someone in all respects man's equal, one who was like himself a free agent, gifted with intellect and endowed with immortality, not a partaker merely of his animal gratifications, but also able to enter into all his feelings as a moral and responsible being. Her other questions are also very Lockean. There's a little bit of non-Locke in there, of course. She's got, got her Christian views in there too. Her other questions are very Lockean as well. What are women's duties and privileges, she asks. What sphere did God create her to move in? Sarah concluded that God created man and woman as equals. Only God may rule woman, not another human being, not a man. Woman, she said, is accountable to God alone for the use of her talents. It was what men said about themselves. In much of the rest of the book, Sarah takes up the implications for women's equality. She has chapters on women in authority, women ministers, women's intellect, women's social intercourse, women's dress, women's legal disabilities, and women who are married. There's no chapter on women as political beings. For really, what could she say? But in the chapter on law, she notes with sting that, quote, woman has no political existence with the exception of the right to petition, which is what she and her sister were doing all the summer that she was writing this book. They were organizing women to sign petitions to oppose slavery. Toward the end of the book, Sarah sums up forcefully her views on women's equality by putting most of the following sentence in all caps, which was very emphatic for Sarah. Angelina used caps more often than Sarah. Quote, to me, it is perfectly clear that whatsoever it is morally right for a man to do, it is morally right for a woman to do. So there you have it. Using natural rights theory to claim equality for women, however one defined equality, was not new, of course. Most famously, Mary Wollstonecraft makes that argument in The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was actually published in 1792, the year Sarah was born. So Wollstonecraft was definitely a whole generation ahead of Sarah. Wollstonecraft argues that neither virtue nor reason, the central aspects of natural rights, have gender because women, like men, are human. But the book focuses mainly on the claim that women are men's social and intellectual equals. She makes only a tentative proposal that women might possess equal political rights, and she never develops the idea. But obviously she did want to, because she says in the introduction that she was planning to write another book about women and political rights, but she never did. Wollstonecraft claimed equality for women in broad terms, but she also struggled to sort out just how much she thought women were actually equal to men. One scholar notes that at times she seemed to go for full equality and reject the idea of an essential core meaning of maleness and femaleness, but at other times she did not. For example, there are pages in the book where Wollstonecraft accepts that men and women are different in the kinds of activities they enjoy. She says, well, men, of course, are going to hunt, and why would women want to do that? The evidence suggests that Sarah read Wollstonecraft's book before she wrote the letters. This is a newsflash. I discovered it working on this talk. She was likely introduced to it by Lucretia Mott, who first read it in 1827, and after that kept her copy of Vindication on her parlor table and lent it out to anyone who wanted to read it. Although Mott and Sarah were both Philadelphia Quakers, they did not become friends until 1836, when Sarah joined the abolition movement, of which Mott was, of course, a leader. Mott remembered that Sarah read Wollstonecraft's book in the mid-1830s, and that she was as impressed with the book as Mott herself was. So they obviously talked about it. The similarity of some of Sarah's and Wollstonecraft's descriptions of gendered injustice are certainly notable. As Eileen Hunt Botting and Christine Carey, those are some political scientists down at Notre Dame, point out, the two women present the same critiques at many points of the Christian defense of the wife's subjugation to the husband. Sarah and Wollstonecraft also agree that God created man and woman as equal immortal beings, that man has no right to rule over woman. In essence, their argument for women's equality was the same. Frances Wright never wrote, Frances Wright is my second woman, you remember. She never wrote a book about women, as Wollstonecraft did. And it really helps if you write a book, otherwise your ideas tend to get forgotten, although Sarah's have gotten forgotten anyway. But Wright's ideas are scattered across her speeches, which she did publish, which was smart of her. The most important statements appear in two 1829 speeches that are excerpted in the Schneer text. In these, Wright speaks of the vital principle of human equality and men and women's birthright of equality. But like her predecessor and intellectual mentor, Wollstonecraft, Wright focuses on women's social and intellectual equality, which she says will greatly benefit men, which is the key point in her mind, and also Wollstonecraft's, and is essential to society's improvement. This is very much the same as Wollstonecraft. Wright was the most famous radical woman, indeed the only famous radical woman in the 1820s. Sarah and Angelina won that honor in the 1830s. Did Sarah listen to any speeches of Wright's or read the published versions? Wright spoke often in Philadelphia between 1828 and 1830 while Sarah was living there, and Wright's book of lectures were published in 1829 and 1836. But in a deeply religious country, Wright was considered a scandalous woman for her disdain for organized religion. And the Quakers in Philadelphia, who were, of course, an organized religion too, vilified her accordingly. I suspect that in the late 1820s, Sarah, who was deeply religious herself, would have viewed Wright with horror. And that's when Sarah's ties to the Quaker community were the strongest. That said, in 1837, Sarah became a critic of organized religion herself, and so it's possible she read Wright's book of lectures then. It's hard to say. William Lloyd Garrison is the third person whose ideas about women I am addressing here. He was a friend of Sarah's beginning in the fall of 1836. He was, like Sarah, a deeply religious person, and he was also distinctly radical and deeply committed to human rights. Garrison was certainly an important influence on Sarah's ideas about the human rights of enslaved people of African descent. Did he also influence her ideas about women's equality? So I have a mystery. Sarah reprints a long quotation in letters that, if Garrison wrote it, would clinch the case. Unfortunately, Sarah does not identify the author beyond saying that he or she is still alive, which, thank you for that clue. That was important. So here are 2 sentences from this mystery quotation, which is much longer. I know nothing of man's rights or woman's rights. Human rights are all that I recognize. The doctrine that the sex of the body presides over and administers upon the rights and responsibilities of the moral, immortal nature is, to my mind, a doctrine kindred to blasphemy. And that is because it exalts the animal nature, the body, into a monarch and humbles the moral nature into a slave, making the former, animal nature, a proprietor, and the latter its property. That's the piece of the quote. So I've been trying for 2 years to figure out who wrote this. I did not find the passage in Wollstonecraft's Vindication, which is digitalized. And for a while I wondered if it came from Francis Wright's pen. But the mystery author speaks of man's immortal nature, and in a sentence I haven't quoted to you here, of God's government. And Wright was a secularist. She would never have referred to immortality or to God. So I came up with a lot of hypotheses, some of which turned out they were people who were dead, so that made it easier. But even the living ones, they still the ideas didn't match what was in the passage. And Google Books, fascinatingly enough, I'm sure you all think, well, didn't you just check Google Books? I mean, yes, I did. That was the first thing I did. Google Books was no help. Apparently, this passage is not in any book other than Sarah's. Bear in mind, Google Books is books. Garrison did not occur to me at first because I did not think of him as a feminist. I don't think anyone so far has written about him that way. And then a few years ago, I came across a great collection of feminist writings by Miriam Schneer. And that was my first clue, because she had Garrison in there as a feminist. And I went, whoa. That was my first clue that he was more of a feminist than any of his biographers had noticed. So on the face of things, now that Garrison pops up as an option, I'm going, well, that seems logical. Both because he used natural rights arguments and biblical arguments when arguing about anything, and he was a passionate advocate for women's rights in the radical sense, which is pure equality for everyone. And then, of course, Sarah was reading his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, every week, and she greatly admired him. The excerpt in Schneer relates to Garrison's ideas about gender hierarchy, which I will discuss in a moment. But right now I'm talking about women's equality, so I wanted to share with you something that Garrison wrote about that. Unfortunately, so far I haven't been able to find anything that he wrote during or before the summer of '37 about women's equality. And that's because the great bulk of his writings are digitally hidden from view. Mostly his writings appeared only in The Liberator, and that has never been fully searchable on Google. Mind-boggling, isn't it? Yeah. Very frustrating, now that we're all used to this great, thing. Of course, that fact also encourages me to think that he may well be the author of the mystery passage. That would explain why I can't find it. Meanwhile, I found a set of resolutions he wrote for the 1853 American Anti-Slavery Convention, American Anti-Slavery Society Convention, that he published in The Liberator. And actually, I did find that through Google, but that's because someone is in the process of indexing The Liberator, and they haven't done very much, but they did index this. But I still don't know if the whole database is going to be searchable, which is what I'm going to find out soon, I hope. But this is like a brand new project that just started. Isn't that amazing? So it's very exciting. But so far, not yet useful to me, except I found this. So the first resolution reads, in the 1850s are when the first national women's rights conventions are held. Seneca Falls is the very beginning, and then there's a pause. Well, there is another one, but then they become national conventions starting in 1850. So in that context, and also because the American Anti-Slavery Society split over the issue partly of women's being able to participate as members, and Garrison was the wing that won the name and welcomed women. So he's got a lot of people who support him on women's rights now in the society, and everyone else left and formed their own different society. So the resolution read that the natural rights of one human being are those of every other, and in all cases equally sacred and inalienable. The boasted rights of man, about which we hear so much, are simply the rights of woman, about which we hear so little. In other words, they are the rights of humankind, neither affected by or independent or dependent on sex or condition. So that sounds very much to me like a version of the mystery quotation. So I leave you with the mystery. Across her book, Sarah describes the gender hierarchy. She calls it man's dominion over woman and refers to the lust of dominion. Indeed, she believes the gender hierarchy to be her main subject. She describes the book with irony as an account of that oppression which woman has suffered in every age and country from her protector, italicized, a man. No, man, she says. As to the origins of that oppression, Sarah locates it in the moment after God created human beings, when mankind fell into sin. After the fall, she writes, Adams wanted to dominate, and the only intelligent being around was Eve. In other words, he could dominate the animals, okay, but in saying this, she is saying that male domination is deeply embedded in the entire history of mankind. She then outlines how the male system of oppression worked. Quote, all history attests that man has subjected woman to his will, used her as a means to promote his selfish gratification, to minister to his sensual pleasures, to be instrumental in promoting his comfort, but never has he desired to elevate her to that rank she was created to fill. He has done all he could to debase and enslave her mind. And now he looks triumphantly on the ruin he has wrought and says, the being he has thus deeply injured is his inferior. Her very syntax captures whom she holds responsible for the problem and for the solution. The subject of her sentences is men. And therefore, the solution is clear. She writes, all I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God designed us to occupy. Sarah Grimke wants men to dismantle what today we call the patriarchy. In that sense, she was a radical feminist. Wollstonecraft, who was of course writing 40 years earlier, is also angry, but less at men, whom she considers ignorant for their oppression of women's minds, than she is angry at women for accepting the judgment of their inferiority. It is the governed, she says, who decide the destinies of the governors. Wollstonecraft wants women to wake up. She puts the responsibility for the state of societal change squarely on them, charging them with being proud of their weakness and with submitting to oppression. As for men, she believes they are simply not paying attention to how women's ignorance limits their own lives. Fathers and husbands, she says, do you not see how in the mental bondage of your wives and fair companions, ye yourselves are bound? Frances Wright echoes Wollstonecraft on all these points. Like Wollstonecraft, she is particularly focused on the power of men in the family. And like Wollstonecraft, she believes that women will redeem society if they educate themselves. Society will never be polished and enlightened, she says, until women are cultivated and wise and free. William Lloyd Garrison, on the other hand, like Sarah, emphasizes that the gender hierarchy is an ancient and powerful system that men are fully in charge of and are determined to maintain control over. In 1838, he writes in The Liberator that the main obstacles women face are men's prejudices, the pride and love of supremacy, the monopoly of power. And in 1853, in the text included in the Schneer collection, he tackles head-on what Sarah implies when she commands men to remove their feet off women's necks, that men keep this system in place intentionally. Garrison wrote, there is such a thing as intelligent wickedness, a design on the part of those in power to further their own interests. I believe that as man has monopolized for generations all the rights which belong to women, It has not been accidental. I believe that man has done this through calculation, actuated by a spirit of pride, a desire for domination, which has made him degrade woman in her own eyes. It is man, he concludes, who is responsible for the tyrannical power of man. Garrison and Sarah both first applied these ideas about the tyrannical power of men to slaveholders. And I think that obviously that was so deep in their analysis that the transfer over to women was for them natural. But then there were plenty of abolitionists who never made that transfer. So I think that's another way of saying that their engagement with the tyranny involved in slavery was much deeper than for most abolitionists. But that's another subject. Garrison was slavery's boldest critic, and sometimes he risked his life for the abolition cause. Sarah, who obviously grew up with the slavery all around her in her family, in the slave in her room, in the room next door, in the kitchen, in the dining room, in the parlor. She had been eyewitness to the system's brutality, and as of 1837 was in the midst of campaigning to persuade others to see how the lust of domination was keeping the slavery system in place in the South. She also had suffered for years under the domination of male Quaker elders who refused to let her flourish as a preacher. Given all this, I believe Garrison's radical ideas on human rights were likely a key influence on Sarah Grimke's feminism. But if we give Garrison much credit, we cannot give him all of it. While Garrison focused on men's responsibility, their intelligent wickedness, Sarah captured the infuriating injustice that permeated woman's experience. And after all, it was Sarah, not Garrison, who wrote the book. Not surprisingly, Sarah's feminist ideas, brought together as they were in a book that could be read and passed from hand to hand, were powerfully influential on the young women of her day. 20-year-old Lucy Stone said, after reading the letters, that she was freshly determined, in her words, to call no man master. Lucretia Mott called the letters the most important work since Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton found the book so powerful she told everyone she met to read it and asked Lucretia Mott, who kept a supply of copies, to send her as many as she could. In recognition of Sarah Grimke's pioneer place in the emerging women's rights movement, her friends Stanton and Mott invited her to attend the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, but she didn't go. If nothing else, I hope this analysis captures some of the complexities of late 18th and early 19th century feminisms. Certainly, the contrasts and similarities between Sarah's and her contemporaries' views remind us that there is nothing new about our modern debates over feminism's meanings. This analysis also highlights to me the extent to which life experience and historical context shape theorist thought, although I have barely touched on that subject here. I also hope this analysis has deepened your interest in Sarah's book, which, by the way, is available as a used book and an ebook from ABE Books website. While Wollstonecraft's book, I don't know where the last page is, but here it is often cited as a breakthrough book of feminism, Sarah's is not. Still, because Miriam Schneer's textbook is used in so many classrooms and has been in print since 1972, Schneer has probably done more than anyone else except Gerda Lerner to keep Sarah Grimke's name in circulation in discussions of feminism. Perhaps in time, Sarah's name will be even more widely known in that context. I hope my book will help with that. And to me, Sarah's most important contribution to our ongoing feminist discussion was her impatient and articulate insistence that the dominant system of gender depression needed dismantling. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.